You know, I love to speak about the sacrament of confession, this beautiful gift of God's mercy that comes to us. And today I'd like to introduce you to one of my favorite saints, who was one of the great confessors of the 20th century. And I know if you think about confessor saints, you think of John Vianney. Of course, that was the 19th century. And I already gave you the clue. It's the 20th century, so you know it's not him. So you think of the 20th century, go, Padre Pio. Close. Close. Really close. But not quite. Same country. Same religious order. Overlapping lifespans. But a different saint. I'd like to introduce you to my buddy, Saint Leopold Mandic. Now, Mandic doesn't sound like an Italian name, and you'd be right. He came from that area that we know as Montenegro, the ex-Yugoslavia, just across the Adriatic Sea. But he came to Italy to enter the Franciscans because their novitiate was in Padua, in northern Italy. Padua, of course, the famous city as the place where St. Anthony did so much work, that earlier Franciscan. St. Leopold, though, had a beautiful heart for reconciliation. And by reconciliation, he didn't at first think it meant confession. He wanted to reconcile peoples that were at odds with one another. And in particular, growing up where he did, where there was great division between Catholics and Orthodox, he wanted to see the unity of the church. He wanted to be a missionary in his homeland to bring Christians together, to serve the Lord together. But unfortunately, St. Leopold had a very poor health. You know, at every time that he was sent on a mission, his health failed and he had to go back and recuperate. So eventually his superiors said, nope, no more going out on mission. You're going to stay right here in Padua. This is where you're going to serve the Lord. It was a great disappointment. It was a great suffering. But he didn't let that lead him into frustration and despair. Instead, he said, okay, God has a different plan. And so he became this wonderful confessor. He brought unity between the soul of the sinner and God, day by day, minute by minute, hearing countless confessions. And he was renowned for it. People would come from all over, and there'd be long lines. And it's so funny how God picks the weak. You know, not only was his health bad, St. Leopold was very, very petite in stature. He was about 4'10", about the same size as Mother Teresa. You know, and sometimes God, again, picks these little ones to show his greatness, that all the mighty power comes from God, not from this person. And St. Leopold lived his humble Franciscan life there, hearing confessions, you know, and it was through him that many special graces were received by people. There were healings and other miracles. Let me tell you about one of my favorite miracles. St. Leopold had gone on pilgrimage to Lourdes. And as he's coming back from Lourdes, you know, it was a long walk from the train station to the Franciscan friary. And so they decided to send a carriage to pick him up. And in those days, you know, the early 20th century, the city of Padua had just put in streetcars, but they're medieval streets. So there's not room for a streetcar and something else at the same time. Well, his carriage driver wasn't paying attention. And he turned into a street just as the streetcar is whooshing by. And everybody in the street screams because they know there's going to be a terrible accident. And all of a sudden, the streetcar has passed the carriage and nothing happened. So the streetcar driver gets out and said, you know, I tried to slam on my brakes, but there was no time. And people are going, well, how was there no accident? The streetcar driver said, well, I felt the street widen and then narrow again. And sure enough, the people measured the street, the streetcar, and the carriage. They don't fit. They don't fit. It was a miracle. And everybody knew that instinctively. They knew you can't have a streetcar and something else there, but they proved it. And they were just in amazement at this. And then they saw Father Leopold was the one in the carriage. Oh, it's Father Leopold. And he started crying, no, it's Our Lady, Our Lady. I came back from a pilgrimage. It must have been Our Lady. This wonderful miracle. To this day, that carriage is preserved at his shrine in Padua as a reminder of the ways that God looks out for us if we allow him, and the reminder of the holiness of this man. That's why I always pray to St. Leopold right after praying to St. Christopher when I get in the car for driving. So those of you maybe especially that have teenagers who are starting to drive, cultivate a devotion to St. Leopold and make your teenagers pray to St. Leopold to avoid accidents. But more than physical accidents, St. Leopold was helping us to avoid the spiritual accident of sin. Talk about a train wreck, right? Where we go off the rails, where we leave the love of God and turn away from him to sin. And that's why Pope Francis, several years ago during the Jubilee Year for Mercy, he brought two saints to St. Peter's on Ash Wednesday as signs of this beautiful sacrament. One of them was, of course, Padre Pio. And the way all the news media reported it, it was so funny. It was, yeah, the great Padre Pio and some other guy. That's some other guy? St. Leopold. And one of the Franciscans who was present at that moment, because both St. Padre Pio and St. Leopold were the same order, one of the Franciscans asked Pope Francis, if both were here, which would you choose as your confessor? And Pope Francis said without a hesitation, St. Leopold. There's a gentleness to St. Leopold. Now, don't get me wrong. Padre Pio is one of my big buddies too. I could give you a video some other day talking about the special favors I've received from him, and he was a fantastic confessor. But in this video, I'd just like to focus on St. Leopold and his gentleness, his ability to listen with compassion. That's a skill all of us need, not just priests. All of us need to learn that skill of listening with compassion to the people around us, trying to lift their burdens rather than I'm too busy with my own burdens, or rather than piling burdens on one another. To listen with compassion. St. Leopold at a certain point was called before his bishop because he was accused of being too lenient on sinners. And so they thought he must, he's not all the way up to speed on things. It must be his theology is deficient. So they grilled him on moral theology. They tested him, all these questions, this whole panel of theologians that the bishop put together. And he got all the answers right. And so the bishop said to him, well, you understand what's a sin, what's a mortal sin. How come you are so lenient? What gives? And St. Leopold, I know. It's Jesus' fault. He set a bad example for me. Jaw drop. They never questioned St. Leopold ever again. He learned from the Master Jesus' tenderness towards sinners. And that's what he brought to the confessional. All of us can have moments of discouragement where we think, I can't believe I committed that same sin again, or I'm never going to be a saint. This is just too tough. And look at this, that, and the other. Or maybe we were in confession sometime and didn't find a priest who was gentle and compassionate. I always pray, don't let me have a bad day, Lord. I'm human, and don't let me be impatient. I don't want to ever do anything that would be an obstacle to people receiving your mercy. But priests are humans, and so maybe you had a bad experience. And so you are always in trepidation of confession, or just stay away. Don't let human failings stand between you and that tenderness that God wants to give you his merciful love. St. Leopold was a beautiful sign of that. He died before World War II began, just a few years, but he prophesied that the war was coming. Now you could say, okay, political observers could have done that, but he did more than that. He made specific prophecies, including the destruction of his own Franciscan friary. And he patted the wall of the little room where he'd meet with people and counsel them and hear confessions. He patted the walls of the room. He said, this place will be destroyed except for this room, because so much of God's mercy has flown through here. And sure enough, the bombs that came obliterated the friary up to that wall. And that room is still preserved. You know, the funny thing about St. Leopold, that after all of his physical health problems, his body is preserved incorrupt. Incorrupt. In fact, they didn't know that until maybe about 10 years ago. They were redoing some things at the shrine and wanted to make a new altar. And so they exhumed his body and found it incorrupt. And Padua is a great university city, one of the oldest universities in the world. And so the science department there said, oh, great, let's do some experiments and all this. They did. They found there are still living cells within his body. And the friar there that was explaining this to me, the Franciscan father, said to me, he said, go ahead and pray to him, because in his ear there are living cells. He's listening. Now, isn't that beautiful? He's listening. He always listened with compassion as a confessor. He's still listening to us now as an intercessor for us with God. Get to know the saints. It's fun. It's beautiful to see how God's grace transformed them, and it's beautiful to experience their friendship with us. And let St. Leopold help you to put aside any fear, any discouragement in approaching confession. Ask him to help you make a good examination of conscience, to approach the Lord with a humble and contrite heart, and then ask him to help you have the peace and the joy that come from experiencing God's mercy in that beautiful sacrament to which he dedicated his life. Today, May the 12th, is his feast day. Let's celebrate the beauty of holiness and the beauty of God's mercy coming to all of us. God bless you.